Antique dealer Rebecca Martinez had attended hundreds of estate sales across Boston. Yet the Victorian mansion on Beacon Hill promised a discovery worthy of legend. The Ashworth family had occupied the house for more than a century, and their heirs were at last emptying rooms layered with the dust of generations. Amid leaning stacks of photograph albums and trays of tarnished trinkets and true daguerreotypes, Rebecca uncovered a particularly captivating family portrait dated May 1913 in elegant script. The sepia-toned image preserved a tableau of domestic perfection, a refined couple posed in their parlor, the mother cradling an infant in an elaborate christening gown, while two impeccably dressed children stood at her side as if frozen mid-curtsy and mid-bow. The composition bore the hallmarks of a skilled professional, every line and angle deliberate. Behind the family, an ornate mahogany cabinet gleamed with fine china and crystal, its glass doors catching the scene with uncommon clarity for the era, as if the furniture itself wished to bear witness. The whole photograph radiated prosperity and contentment, precisely the kind of nostalgic Americana her customers adored. Rebecca purchased several bundles of images, already plotting to trace their provenance for her shop, confident the 1913 portrait would sell quickly to collectors seeking the comforting hum of pre-World War I life. That evening, beneath the cool blaze of LED lights, she began cataloging the haul. When she lifted the family portrait to her magnifying glass, a small irregularity tugged at her attention. The infant in the central image looked peaceful and aware, nestled securely in its mother's arms. Yet within the mirrored cabinet panes, the baby seemed different, subtly wrong. She shifted the desk lamp and peered again, and a tremor ran through her fingers as her breath thinned with surprise. The detail she had found would soon unspool a century-old mystery that upended everything the cheerful photograph appeared to promise. The next morning, she tested the print under shifting lamps and increasing magnification, seeking a trick of light or an artifact of the emulsion. What persisted defied simple explanation. In the direct image, the child appeared lively and cherished. But in the glass reflection, the infant looked unnaturally still. The small face emptied of expression, a vacancy that chilled her. Worse, the reflected limbs seemed posed at angles too rigid for a relaxed embrace, contradicting the natural posture in the main scene. With a growing sense that she was reading a message hidden in plain sight, Rebecca reached for the phone and called her friend, Dr. Patricia Williams, a historian of early American photography and funeral customs, certain that only a specialist could tell her whether the glass had captured not a moment of life, but an echo of death. Patricia arrived swiftly, carrying her portable analysis equipment and the weight of years spent studying the silent language of old photographs. She reminded Rebecca that Victorian and Edwardian images often bore oddities because of long exposure times, when subjects were forced into statuesque stillness, sometimes producing unsettling effects. Yet as she leaned closer to the glass reflection, her scholarly calm began to fray. "This is highly unusual," she murmured, her voice edged with disbelief. "The reflection contains details that should not exist. Look closely at the eyes. The baby's gaze is open in the main image, but in the reflection, the lids are shut. The positions of the limbs don't even correspond." Together they created high-resolution scans, layering the main photograph against its mirrored twin pixel by pixel. The results left no room for doubt. The portrait did not capture a simple family memory. It preserved a deception. Patricia's face grew troubled as she voiced her conclusion. "Rebecca, you may be holding a memorial photograph, a post-mortem image meant to disguise death as life, with the reflection betraying what the photographer tried to conceal." The thought struck Rebecca with a hollow weight, raising disturbing questions about the Ashworth family's history. The following day, Patricia returned armed with books, notes, and grim examples of the era's customs. She explained that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when infant mortality was heartbreakingly common, families often resorted to memorial photographs as their only keepsake. The practice peaked between 1840 and 1920, a time when death visited homes with relentless frequency. Patricia spread images across the desk that revealed unsettling ingenuity, bodies propped on hidden stands, eyelids painted to simulate wakefulness, families clustered around children who would never laugh again. These photographs, though heartbreaking, were tender attempts to preserve memory. Patricia pointed back to the Ashworth portrait. "The reflection suggests deliberate staging," she explained. The photographer likely arranged the baby to appear alive in the direct image. But the cabinet glass betrayed the truth, capturing the rigidity and stillness consistent with post-mortem technique. The revelation turned what once seemed like a charming family memento into a window on grief and concealment, a frozen moment that whispered of loss more than love. Rebecca felt an icy shiver trace her spine as the realization settled over her. The seemingly joyful family portrait might not have been a celebration of life at all, but instead a farewell to a child already gone. The christening gown, the carefully arranged parlor, the professional photography all matched the traditions of families desperate to preserve a single image of their lost little one. While Patricia scoured genealogical records in search of any mention of infant deaths in the Ashworth line around 1913, Rebecca reached out to the estate sale organizers, hoping to trace living descendants who might provide clarity. What had once seemed like a charming collectible was swiftly becoming a fragile window into grief, layered with secrecy and the quiet deceptions of memorial photography. The cabinet glass, with its unyielding reflection, had revealed a truth the Ashworths themselves may have struggled to face. That truth eventually brought Rebecca face to face with Margaret Ashworth Thompson, the great-granddaughter of the very family frozen in the portrait. Margaret, now in her 70s, agreed to meet at a cafe near Boston Common, her hands trembling slightly as she studied the image with recognition shadowed by sorrow. "I remember my grandmother showing me this photograph when I was a girl," Margaret whispered. "She always called it the last picture of baby William before he passed away." Her voice faltered as she added that William's death had come suddenly in the spring of 1913, and that Elizabeth Ashworth, his mother, never fully recovered from the loss. Family stories told of William as Elizabeth's third child and first son, a birth that had secured both joy and legacy for the Ashworth household. Robert Ashworth's shipping enterprise had made them wealthy and respected, and William's arrival was celebrated as proof of the family's strength. Yet tragedy intervened. William fell ill with what they called summer complaint, an ailment we would now understand as acute gastroenteritis or dysentery. The timing of his death coincided precisely with the date of the portrait. Margaret retrieved a small leather diary once belonging to her great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth. The entries around May 1913 were heavy with grief, filled with the voice of a mother clinging desperately to memory. One entry struck Rebecca with particular force. The photographer assured me William would appear as if merely sleeping peacefully in my arms. "No one will ever know our beautiful boy had already gone to God." In her words lay both anguish and determination, a plea for remembrance cloaked in artifice. The reflection in the cabinet glass had preserved the reality Elizabeth could not bear to accept. Patricia's continued research traced the photographer back to Whitman and Associates, among the most prestigious studios in Boston at the time, whose archives promised further clues about how this carefully staged illusion came into being. The Whitman studio had long catered to Boston's most prominent families, offering elegant society portraits, while quietly providing the delicate service of memorial photography. a practice essential in an era when infant mortality was high. But grief was often hidden behind closed doors. In the archives of the Boston Public Library, Patricia and Rebecca uncovered the studio's ledgers, and among them was the Ashworth Commission, dated May 15, 1913. The entry carried instructions unlike those of ordinary family sittings: memorial portrait infant subject, family grouping emphasis on natural positioning and lighting, utmost discretion required. The accompanying technical notes, penned by photographer Harrison Whitman himself, revealed the painstaking methods used to construct an illusion of life. He detailed the careful placement of supports out of the camera's sight, the post-exposure technique of painting the infant's eyelids to appear open, and the coaching of the family to maintain gentle expressions during the long exposure. Whitman even noted the issue of reflective surfaces, acknowledging that while most could be avoided, the mahogany cabinet behind the family remained at the client's insistence. He recognized the risk, but could not have foreseen how clearly the glass would betray the truth of the scene. Further correspondence between Whitman and his peers shed light on the ethical struggles within his profession. Many families resist facing the finality of their loss. Whitman confided to one colleague, "Our role is not merely to record, but to comfort, offering them an image that preserves dignity in their darkest hours." He saw himself not only as a photographer, but as a counselor, weaving grief and memory into a fragile narrative of solace. The Ashworth Commission, he admitted, had been among the most difficult. Elizabeth Ashworth demanded perfection, a photograph with no sign that her beloved son had died, and Whitman rose to that demand with artistry and compassion. Margaret Ashworth Thompson contributed further to the picture by sharing more pages from Elizabeth's diary. The entries revealed a mother caught between the crushing weight of private grief and the rigid expectations of Boston society. On June 2, 1913, Elizabeth wrote with both gratitude and sorrow. The photograph arrived today. Mr. Whitman has worked a miracle. William appears so peaceful, so perfect. When visitors see it, they remark on what a beautiful, healthy baby he was. I smile and agree, though my heart breaks with each compliment. Her words painted the portrait of a woman who clung to illusion not out of deceit, but out of love, preserving for the world the image of the child she could not keep. Elizabeth placed the portrait in a place of honor within the Ashworth parlor, where its presence became both comfort and performance. Visitors admired the graceful family scene, never realizing it was a memorial image, while Elizabeth spoke of William as though he were resting quietly in another room. Her diary from June 15, 1913, captured the fragile illusion Mrs. Harrison asked about William during tea today. I found myself describing his recent growth as though he were upstairs in the nursery. The photograph makes such conversations possible. It preserves the illusion that our family remains complete. While Robert Ashworth accepted the loss, with a stoic resolve preferring to put reminders aside, Elizabeth clung to the portrait as her lifeline, fearing the pity and diminished respect that public acknowledgement of William's death might bring. By July 4th, her writing revealed Robert's concern. Robert grows concerned about my attachment to the photograph. He says I speak of William as if he were still with us. Perhaps he is right. But the portrait allows me to maintain the fiction that our happiness was not destroyed by God's cruel whim. Over the months that followed, Elizabeth's diary entries slipped further from reality. She planned William's first birthday and purchased clothes for him that would never be worn. The portrait had become her anchor to an imagined world, a source of comfort that deepened her denial. Margaret, reading these words decades later, admitted with quiet sadness that her grandmother always believed Elizabeth never recovered, trapped in a fragile reality where William still lived The Ashworth family faced a dilemma shaped as much by social expectation as by medical understanding. Robert's letters to his shipping partner, preserved in the Boston Maritime Museum archives, revealed his growing desperation. Elizabeth continues to speak of William as though he were thriving upstairs. Yesterday she set a place for him at dinner and grew agitated when I suggested removing it. Our friends are beginning to notice her peculiarities. Dr. Samuel Morton, the family physician who had overseen William's short life, recorded her decline in clinical notes with the language available in 1913. Patient exhibits signs of melancholia with delusions. Refuses to acknowledge infant's demise. Maintains elaborate fantasies about child's continued existence. Recommend discreet family management to avoid institutional commitment. With mental health burdened by stigma, the Ashworths had little recourse beyond secrecy. Robert quietly hired extra household staff to manage Elizabeth, while protecting the family's reputation in Boston society. The portrait became the fulcrum of this charade, both a comfort to Elizabeth and a mask to the outside world. Letters from Elizabeth's sister in New York revealed the strain within the household. Elizabeth led me through the home speaking of William as if he were only napping. The photograph remains prominently displayed, and she speaks of it as though taken yesterday. Robert looks worn thin from the weight of maintaining this fiction, yet fears the scandal should Elizabeth's condition be exposed. The photograph, that once embodied parental love, had become both prison and disguise, a single captured moment, sustaining a fragile illusion against the relentless truth of loss. Caroline and James, the Ashworth children who stood solemnly beside their parents in the 1913 portrait, were pressed into a role no child should bear. At only 7 and 5, they were quietly instructed to uphold their mother's fragile fantasy whenever visitors called, speaking of William as though he were upstairs napping or out for a walk with a nursemaid. This collective deception spared Elizabeth the stigma of institutionalization, but it also ensnared the entire family in a fiction that distorted their daily lives. The photograph, meant to immortalize a moment of love, had instead become the foundation of a lie, its reflection preserving the exact moment when the Ashworths began living in denial. By autumn of 1913, Elizabeth's diary showed her, unraveling her words, caught between yearning and torment. October 12th, I stared at the photograph for hours. At times I see movement in the cabinet glass, as if William is trying to tell me something. Robert says I am imagining it, but I know my son's spirit lives within that image. The same reflection that revealed the truth to Rebecca and Patricia a century later had become for Elizabeth a supernatural thread of connection. She began to treat the photograph as a portal rather than a picture waiting for signs that never came. Years later, Caroline confessed in a letter to a cousin that their mother became convinced William's soul was trapped inside the portrait, speaking to it for hours, whispering questions into silence. The fragile balance collapsed during the family's Christmas gathering in December 1913. Elizabeth, still holding court with poise before her peers, had been proudly describing William's supposed growth when her composure shattered. She screamed at the reflection in the cabinet glass, insisting it contained the truth. Dr. Morton described the episode as a complete nervous collapse. Robert, cornered by circumstance, admitted to their social circle that William had died months earlier. Elizabeth was admitted to a private sanitarium outside Boston, where months of treatment slowly pulled her back to reality. By March 1914, she could write, "I am beginning to remember what truly happened to my dear William." Grief can make the mind conjure illusions of what we most desire. The photograph was my way of keeping him alive, but it also kept me from saying goodbye. When Elizabeth returned home, she asked Robert to put the portrait away, but her spirit never fully recovered. Family accounts described her as quiet, withdrawn, and perpetually melancholy, her once vital presence dimmed forever. Patricia's continued study of Harrison Whitman's professional papers uncovered a haunting coda to the story. In a letter to his photography association dated January 1914, Whitman expressed regret, acknowledging that his artistry meant to console had instead deepened Elizabeth's suffering. "I fear that in striving to grant comfort, I prolonged her torment. We are tasked with creating illusions of life, but sometimes those illusions bind the living as much as they honor the dead." The Ashworth Commission became, in his own words, both his most accomplished and most tragic work, a testament to how memory, love, and grief could all be captured and distorted within a single frame. The Ashworth Memorial Portrait stood as both a technical triumph and an ethical dilemma. In his notes, Harrison Whitman confessed Mrs. Ashworth's demand for absolute realism produced an image so persuasive that she began to believe the fiction herself. "I fear my artistry deepened her torment rather than bringing solace." News of Elizabeth's breakdown traveled quickly through Boston's social circles, and Whitman came to feel personally responsible for crafting a photograph too flawless in its concealment of death. His reflections marked a turning point in his career. He began urging colleagues to use memorial techniques that preserved dignity but acknowledged loss openly, believing this honesty better aided grieving families. Whitman's later correspondence revealed how the truth had slipped into the photograph almost by accident. The mahogany cabinet glass had recorded the infant's actual rigidity before he finalized the illusion, a discrepancy he admitted overlooking in his haste to satisfy the family's wishes. His remorse was profound. He resolved thereafter to leave subtle cues in his memorial work details that would quietly acknowledge death while still offering beauty and remembrance. He even declined commissions that required extensive deception, convinced such images risked becoming prisons for those left behind. In 1920, Whitman wrote one final letter to Robert Ashworth. "I have followed your family's story with heavy concern. Please accept my deepest regret for any role I played in prolonging your wife's anguish. Sometimes the most compassionate art becomes a cruel snare when it succeeds too completely." This acknowledgement mirrored what the cabinet reflection had already testified. The portrait was simultaneously a masterpiece of memorial craftsmanship and a haunting record of a family's desperate denial. Rebecca, recognizing the photograph's cultural and historical significance, donated it to the Boston Due Historical Society. There it became the centerpiece of an exhibit exploring hidden stories in family photography, sparking wider conversations about grief, trauma, and the fragile line between memory and illusion. Margaret Ashworth Thompson collaborated with historians to assemble her family's full account, contributing Elizabeth's diary and Whitman's letters to the scholarly record. These documents became invaluable primary sources for understanding how early 20th century families navigated infant mortality and the silence surrounding mental illness. Dr. Patricia Williams published her analysis in the Journal of American Cultural History, emphasizing the photograph's unique duality. "This single image holds multiple truths," she wrote. The portrait itself shows what the family wanted to believe and what society expected them to present. The reflection captures what truly occurred and preserves the techniques used to construct a comforting illusion. Taken together, they are more than a family keepsake. They are a testament to grief artistry and the cultural practices of 1913 America. The Ashworth photograph endures not merely as an artifact, but as a lesson in how images can both heal and harm, revealing the shadows behind even the most polished facade. The exhibit quickly became one of the Historical Society's most visited displays, drawing in people who were compelled not only by the Ashworth family's story, but also by echoes of their own. Visitors brought forward sepia portraits tucked away in albums and trunks. some recognizing for the first time that the lifelike images of infants or siblings might have been memorial photographs. The exhibit opened a door to conversations long silenced, allowing families to acknowledge how their ancestors endured loss and how grief had been disguised to preserve dignity in eras when mourning was often private and restrained. Rebecca, ever meticulous, compiled records documenting the photograph's provenance, its journey from a Boston estate sale to a museum piece, and its profound cultural impact. Through her efforts, William Ashworth's short life and the way his family struggled to cope with his passing would not vanish into obscurity, but instead be remembered with both accuracy and compassion. The reflection that once risked betraying a carefully guarded family secret had over time transformed into a vital lens for understanding authentic human experience. For Margaret Ashworth Thompson, the closing of the narrative was deeply personal. My great-great-grandmother Elizabeth loved William so much that she couldn't let him go even after death, she said quietly. The photograph allowed her to keep that love alive, even though it came at a terrible cost. But now, more than a century later, their story has been told with truth and empathy. Both William and Elizabeth can finally rest in peace, their bond no longer shrouded in secrecy but recognized and honored. The reflection in the cabinet glass, once an accident of composition, had preserved more than a moment. It had preserved a truth powerful enough to transcend generations. What began as a private tragedy became a universal testament to love loss and the desperate human desire to hold on to what time has taken away.